Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other recruits at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado. While the men around her were built like trucks with shoulders that could carry the world and voices that boomed across the training grounds, Sarah stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with a quiet demeanor that made some question whether she belonged there at all. The mockery started on her first day. As she walked through the base cafeteria carrying her tray, she could hear the snickers behind her back. "Look at that," one of the SEALs muttered to his buddies. "They're letting kindergarten teachers into the program now." The laughter that followed was cruel and cutting, designed to make her feel small and out of place. Sarah had grown up in a rough neighborhood in East Los Angeles, where survival meant learning to fight before you learned to read properly. Her father, a former Marine who worked double shifts at a factory, had taught her that strength wasn't always about the size of your muscles. Her mother, who cleaned offices at night while studying for her nursing degree during the day, showed her that determination could overcome any obstacle. But here, surrounded by men who could bench press twice her body weight, those lessons felt distant and inadequate. The training was brutal for everyone, but it seemed especially designed to break her spirit. During Hell Week, when recruits were pushed to their absolute limits with minimal sleep and constant physical challenges, Sarah found herself struggling more than she had ever imagined possible. The cold Pacific Ocean felt like it was trying to claim her soul during night training exercises. The heavy equipment she had to carry seemed designed for someone twice her size. But what hurt more than the physical pain was the constant commentary from her fellow trainees. They called her soft serve behind her back, a nickname that spread through the base like wildfire. During mess hall conversations, she would overhear them making bets about when she would finally quit and go home. Some gave her a week, others were more generous and said she might last a month. The instructors, while not openly mocking her, seemed skeptical about her chances as well. During combat training exercises, they would pair her with the biggest, strongest recruits, as if trying to prove a point about the reality of warfare. When she struggled to complete an obstacle course in the required time, she could see the disappointment in their eyes, the unspoken message that maybe this wasn't the place for someone like her. The worst incident happened during a training exercise in the mountains of Southern California. The recruits were divided into teams and given a mission to navigate through hostile territory while carrying wounded comrades. Sarah's team was assigned to carry a 200-pound dummy representing an injured soldier through 10 miles of rough terrain. As they struggled up a particularly steep hill, with Sarah taking her turn carrying the dummy's legs while a much larger recruit handled the torso, she heard one of her teammates complaining loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is ridiculous," he said between heavy breaths. "In a real situation, we'd all be dead because we're slowed down by someone who can't pull their weight." The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been pushing herself beyond her limits, ignoring the burning in her muscles and the voice in her head that told her to quit. But hearing those words, knowing that her teammates saw her as a liability rather than an asset, made something inside her crack. That night, as she lay in her bunk listening to the sounds of other recruits sleeping peacefully after another grueling day, Sarah seriously considered packing her bags and leaving. She thought about her family back in Los Angeles, how they would understand if she decided this dream was too big for someone like her. Her younger brother had always looked up to her, calling her his hero, but maybe heroes weren't supposed to be small women who got laughed at by Navy SEALs. The next morning brought another day of training, another opportunity for her to prove herself or fail spectacularly in front of everyone. As she stood in line for breakfast, overhearing more whispered comments about whether she would make it through another week, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to quit, no matter how much they laughed at her, no matter how many times they called her soft. She had no idea that this decision would lead her to a moment where she would have to prove her strength in a way none of them could have imagined, in a place far from the training grounds, where the stakes would be real 3 weeks after Sarah had made her silent promise to never quit. The situation at the training base had only gotten worse. The nicknames had evolved from soft serve to more creative insults that followed her everywhere she went. During morning runs, she would hear them chanting behind her, making jokes about how she needed a head start to keep up with the real soldiers. The breaking point came during a live-fire exercise that was meant to simulate urban combat scenarios. Sarah's squad was tasked with clearing a mock building filled with pop-up targets while under simulated enemy fire. The exercise required split-second decision-making, precise shooting, and seamless teamwork between squad members. As they approached the building, Sarah took point position, her M4 rifle ready, and her mind focused on the task ahead. She had spent extra hours at the shooting range, practicing until her hands were raw and her eyes burned from concentration. Her marksmanship scores were actually among the highest in her class, but somehow that detail always got overlooked when her teammates discussed her performance. The exercise began with the sharp crack of simulated gunfire echoing through the training facility. Sarah moved through the building methodically, her rifle sweeping each corner as she advanced. Behind her, she could hear the heavy footsteps of her teammates and their occasional tactical communications. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until they reached the second floor. The morning of September 15th, 1987, started like any other Tuesday for Sarah Mitchell. She had no way of knowing that by sunset, her name would be whispered in government corridors from Washington to Moscow. Sarah worked as a communications analyst for a small defense contractor in Cleveland, Ohio. Her job involved decoding encrypted military transmissions, a skill she had developed during her 8 years in the Navy before transitioning to civilian work. That Tuesday morning, Sarah received an unusual assignment. Her supervisor, Frank Rodriguez, handed her a manila envelope marked with red security tape. Inside were intercepted radio communications from Eastern European sources, specifically from what appeared to be Soviet military installations near the Polish border. The transmissions were fragmented, but Sarah's trained ear picked up references to something called Operation Lake Mirror. As Sarah worked through the coded messages, she began to piece together something alarming. The communications suggested a planned military exercise that would involve aircraft movements over the Great Lakes region. More concerning were references to asset extraction and deep water protocols. Sarah had seen similar language before during her Navy service, usually in connection with covert operations. By noon, Sarah had decoded enough of the transmissions to realize this was not a routine military exercise. The communications indicated that Soviet agents were planning to use the Great Lakes as a testing ground for new infiltration techniques. They had somehow obtained detailed maps of underwater topography around Erie Lake, along with current patterns and seasonal temperature data. Sarah immediately reported her findings to Frank, who seemed unusually nervous about the information. He told her to continue working on the transmissions, but to keep her findings strictly confidential. Something in his manner made Sarah uneasy. Frank had always been straightforward with her, but now he avoided eye contact and kept checking his watch. Around 3 in the afternoon, Sarah made a breakthrough that changed everything. She discovered that the Soviet operation was not just about testing infiltration routes. They were planning to establish a permanent underwater communication station in Erie Lake, using advanced technology that would allow them to monitor and potentially disrupt NATO communications across the entire Great Lakes region. The implications were staggering. Such a station could intercept military communications from several major American and Canadian military installations. It could also serve as a coordination point for sleeper agents throughout the Midwest. Sarah realized she had stumbled upon one of the most significant intelligence discoveries of the Cold War era. She began preparing a comprehensive report, but before she could finish, Frank appeared at her desk with 2 men she had never seen before. They wore dark suits and had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Frank introduced them as specialists from a Department of Defense who needed to discuss her findings immediately. The men, who identified themselves only as Agent Brooks and Agent Williams, escorted Sarah to a conference room. They questioned her extensively about her decoding process and asked for all her notes and preliminary findings. Sarah cooperated fully, believing she was contributing to national security. However, as the questioning continued, Sarah began to sense something was wrong. The agents seemed more interested in who else might have seen her work than in the actual intelligence value of her discoveries. They asked repeatedly whether she had made copies of any documents or shared information with anyone outside the office. When Sarah mentioned that she planned to write a detailed analysis for her superiors, Agent Brooks exchanged a meaningful look with Agent Williams. They told her that her work was now classified at the highest levels and that she would need to come with them for a more thorough debriefing at a secure location. Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. In her years of government work, she had never been involved in anything requiring this level of security. She asked if she could call her husband to let him know she would be late, but the agents insisted there was no time. They needed to move immediately to prevent any compromise of the operation. As they escorted her from the building, Sarah noticed that Frank would not meet her eyes. Other colleagues watched from their desks with expressions of confusion and concern. Sarah tried to project confidence, but privately she was becoming increasingly worried about the unusual procedures being followed. The agents led her to a black sedan parked outside the building. As they drove through Cleveland's industrial district toward the lake, Sarah asked where they were going. Agent Brooks told her they were heading to a temporary command post that had been established to coordinate the response to the Soviet operation. The drive took them along the shoreline of Erie Lake, where Sarah could see a helicopter waiting in a cleared area near the water. The sight of the aircraft made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Though she could not yet imagine the ordeal that awaited her, the helicopter was a military-style aircraft, unmarked but clearly government issue. As they approached, Sarah could see the pilot performing pre-flight checks while another man in civilian clothes waited nearby. Agent Brooks explained that they would be conducting an aerial reconnaissance of the areas mentioned in the Soviet communications, and Sarah's expertise would be valuable in identifying potential installation sites from above. Sarah climbed into the helicopter with growing unease. Her Navy experience included some flight time, but something felt wrong about this entire operation. The lack of proper briefings, the informal procedures, and the agent's evasive answers to her questions all contradicted standard military protocols she knew well. As the helicopter lifted off over Erie Lake, Agent Williams handed Sarah a set of photographs and maps. He asked her to identify locations that matched references in the decoded transmissions. Sarah spread the materials on her lap and began comparing them with the terrain below. The lake stretched endlessly beneath them, its dark waters hiding whatever secrets might lie in its depths. For nearly an hour, they flew in systematic patterns over the lake. Sarah identified several areas that could potentially match the Soviet plans, including deep water regions with unusual current patterns and areas near shipping channels that would provide cover for underwater operations. She was beginning to feel useful again, thinking her expertise was genuinely needed for national security. Then, everything changed in an instant that would haunt her forever. Without warning, Agent Brooks suddenly grabbed Sarah's arms while Agent Williams reached for her legs. Sarah fought desperately, but the confined space of the helicopter limited her movements. She screamed questions at them, demanding to know what was happening, but neither man responded. Their faces were cold and professional, as if they were completing a routine task. The helicopter's side door was already open for the reconnaissance mission. As Sarah realized what they intended to do, terror overwhelmed her training and experience. She fought with every ounce of strength she possessed, but the two men were larger and had the advantage of position. They wrestled her toward the open door as the aircraft hovered approximately 200 feet above the lake surface. In her final moments before they threw her out, Sarah heard Agent Brooks say something that burned into her memory. The asset knows too much. Deep water protocol is authorized. These words confirmed her worst fears about the true nature of the operation. She was not being protected as a valuable intelligence source, but eliminated as a security risk. The fall seemed to last forever, though it could only have been seconds. Sarah's Navy survival training kicked in automatically. She positioned her body to minimize impact, took a deep breath, and prepared for the shock of hitting the water. The lake rushed up to meet her with terrifying speed. The impact was like hitting concrete. Pain shot through her entire body as she plunged deep beneath the surface. The cold water of Erie Lake in September was a shock that nearly caused her to exhale her precious air supply. But Sarah's military training and survival instincts took over. She fought her way back to the surface, gasping and treading water as the helicopter circled overhead. From the water, Sarah could see the agents looking down at her. She expected them to hover and confirm her death, but instead the helicopter began to climb and turn away. They assumed the fall, and the cold water had finished their job. They had no way of knowing that Sarah was an accomplished swimmer who had survived emergency water training exercises in conditions far worse than this. As the helicopter disappeared toward shore, Sarah assessed her situation. She was alone in the middle of Erie Lake, several miles from the nearest shore, with no rescue in sight. Her body ached from the impact, and the cold water was already beginning to affect her coordination. But she was alive, and her mind was clear enough to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Sarah realized that her supposed colleagues had tried to murder her because of what she had discovered about Operation Lake Mirror. The implications were staggering. If legitimate government agents had wanted her silenced, it could only mean that the Soviet operation was more complex than she had initially understood. There might be American collaborators involved, or the operation itself might be something entirely different from what the communications had suggested. Floating in the dark water, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. Instead of simply trying to survive and return to shore to report what had happened, she would use this apparent death to her advantage. If her attackers believed she was dead, she could investigate the truth about Operation Lake Mirror without being hunted. But first, she had to survive. The shore was a long way off, and the water temperature was dropping as evening approached. Sarah began swimming toward what she estimated was the closest shoreline, pacing herself carefully to conserve energy. Her military training had prepared her for exactly this type of emergency, though she had never imagined using those skills under such circumstances. As she swam, Sarah's mind raced with questions and possibilities. Who were the real agents Brooks and Williams? How high up did this conspiracy reach? And, most importantly, what was the true purpose of Operation Lake Mirror? The answers to these questions were somewhere on shore, waiting to be discovered by a woman who was now officially dead. Sarah's swim to shore took nearly 4 hours. By the time she dragged herself onto a rocky beach near Ashtabula, Ohio, darkness had fallen and her body was numb with cold. She lay gasping on the stones for several minutes, allowing her circulation to return and her strength to recover. The lights of a small fishing village twinkled in the distance, but Sarah knew she could not simply walk into town and ask for help. If the people who had tried to kill her believed she was dead, that gave her a crucial advantage. But it also meant she could not contact anyone from her previous life, including her husband Tom. The thought of what he would go through when she failed to come home was almost unbearable, but Sarah knew that revealing her survival too soon would put both of them in danger. Sarah made her way carefully through the darkness toward the village. Her clothes were soaked and torn, and she needed dry clothing and shelter before hypothermia set in. She found an unlocked summer cottage on the outskirts of town and broke in through a window. Inside, she found women's clothing that approximately fit her, along with canned food and bottled water. As she warmed up and changed clothes, Sarah began to plan her next moves. She needed to find out who had ordered her death and why. More importantly, she needed to determine whether Operation Lake Mirror was a genuine Soviet threat or something else entirely. The behavior of the supposed agents suggested that American officials were involved in whatever was happening. Sarah found a small amount of cash in the cottage and left an equivalent amount behind to pay for what she had taken. She also found a regional telephone directory and began researching her options. The nearest major city was Cleveland, where her investigation had begun. But returning there too soon would be dangerous if her supposed death was being monitored. Instead, Sarah decided to travel to Buffalo, New York, where she knew there was a major FBI field office. If she could reach legitimate federal agents and tell her story, they might be able to protect her and investigate the conspiracy she had uncovered. But first, she needed to gather more evidence about what had really happened. Over the next 3 days, Sarah lived like a fugitive, moving between abandoned buildings and using public libraries to research Operation Lake Mirror and the defense contractor where she had worked. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Her employer, Meridian Defense Systems, had connections to several companies that were being investigated for selling military technology to foreign governments. More disturbing was what she learned about her supervisor, Frank Rodriguez. Public records showed that he had traveled to Eastern Europe several times in the past year, supposedly for legitimate business meetings. But the timing of his trips coincided with increased Soviet activity in the region. Sarah began to suspect that Frank was not the loyal American she had thought him to be. Sarah also discovered that the radio transmissions she had decoded might have been deliberately leaked to her. If Frank was working with foreign agents, he could have arranged for her to receive specific communications that would draw her into a trap. The entire Operation Lake Mirror might have been a setup designed to identify and eliminate American intelligence analysts who were too skilled at their jobs. On her 4th day as a fugitive, Sarah made contact with FBI agent Patricia Chun in Buffalo. Sarah called the FBI office from a payphone and asked to speak with someone about a matter of national security. When Agent Chun came on the line, Sarah gave her real name and enough details about Operation Lake Mirror to convince the agent that this was not a prank call. Agent Chun agreed to meet Sarah at a secure location. When they met that evening in a Buffalo hotel room, Sarah told her entire story, beginning with the decoded transmissions and ending with her survival of the helicopter incident. Agent Chun listened carefully, taking detailed notes and asking probing questions about dates, names, and specific details. What Agent Chun told Sarah in return was both reassuring and terrifying. The FBI had been investigating Meridian Defense Systems for several months as part of a larger investigation into technology theft and industrial espionage. They suspected that someone inside the company was feeding information to foreign intelligence services, but they had not identified the specific individual involved. Sarah's story provided crucial missing pieces to their investigation. Agent Chun explained that the FBI had been monitoring communications between several defense contractors and suspected foreign agents, but they had not been able to decode the transmissions that Sarah had worked on. Her analysis of Operation Lake Mirror was the first concrete evidence of active espionage operations being conducted on American soil. However, Agent Chun also delivered sobering news about the scope of the conspiracy. The FBI believed that the espionage network included American officials at high levels of government and military service. The people who had tried to kill Sarah were likely part of this network, and they would continue hunting for her if they suspected she had survived. Agent Chun offered Sarah protective custody, but with conditions that Sarah found difficult to accept. She would have to remain hidden under a false identity until the investigation was complete, which could take months or even years. During that time, she could have no contact with her family or friends. Her husband would have to continue believing she was dead. Sarah asked about alternatives, and Agent Chun presented her with an extraordinary proposal. The FBI needed someone with Sarah's skills and knowledge to go undercover and gather intelligence about the espionage network. If Sarah was willing to take the risk, she could help bring down the conspiracy that had nearly cost her life. The proposal meant that Sarah would have to become someone else entirely. She would be given a new identity and inserted into situations where she could observe and report on suspected foreign agents and their American collaborators. It would be dangerous work, but it would also give her a chance to strike back at the people who had destroyed her life. Sarah looked out the hotel window at the lights of Buffalo and thought about her husband, Tom, who was probably planning her funeral. She thought about her colleagues at Meridian, who had no idea they were working for traitors. Most of all, she thought about the classified information that was being sold to America's enemies, while the people responsible lived comfortable lives. The decision, when it came, surprised even Sarah herself. She turned to Agent Shun and said, "Tell me what you need me to do." Sarah's transformation into an undercover operative took 3 weeks of intensive preparation at a secure FBI facility in Virginia. She was given the identity of Margaret Walsh, a communications specialist with a fabricated employment history that would allow her to infiltrate suspected espionage networks. Her appearance was altered with different hair color and contact lenses, and she spent hours learning the details of her new background until it became second nature. The FBI's plan was audacious in its scope. Margaret Walsh would be hired by Tactical Communications International, a company in Detroit that the FBI suspected was serving as a front for technology transfer to foreign governments. Sarah's job would be to identify the key players in the network and gather evidence of their illegal activities, all while maintaining her cover as a loyal employee. Agent Shin warned Sarah repeatedly about the dangers involved. If her true identity was discovered, the people who had tried to kill her once would not hesitate to finish the job. But Sarah was determined to see the mission through. The thought of her husband grieving for her while her would-be killers walked free gave her the motivation to accept any risk. Sarah's first day at Tactical Communications International was nerve-wracking. The company occupied a modern office building in downtown Detroit, and from the outside it appeared to be a legitimate business. But, as Margaret Walsh, Sarah quickly began to notice subtle signs that something was amiss. Security was unusually tight for a civilian company, and certain areas of the building were restricted to employees with special clearances. Her supervisor at TCI was a man named David Kumar, who had immigrated from India 15 years earlier and had an impressive background in satellite communications. Kumar seemed genuinely friendly and helpful, but Sarah noticed that he asked unusually detailed questions about her previous work experience and technical capabilities. She provided the carefully prepared answers that the FBI had rehearsed with her, while mentally cataloging every detail for her future reports. Within her first week at TCI, Sarah identified several employees who exhibited suspicious behavior. There was Jennifer Harrison, an accountant who regularly worked late and had access to financial records that seemed unrelated to her normal duties. Robert Shun, an engineer who frequently made encrypted phone calls from his office and received mail at a post office box rather than his home address. And most concerning was Elena Volkov, a project manager who had been born in Russia and maintained extensive contacts with technology companies in Eastern Europe. Sarah's breakthrough came during her second week at TCI, when she was assigned to work on a project involving secure communication protocols for overseas clients. As she reviewed the technical specifications, she realized that the equipment being designed could be used to intercept and decode NATO military communications. The project was supposedly for civilian clients in neutral countries, but the capabilities being built into the system were far beyond what any legitimate customer would need. More damning was what Sarah discovered when she accessed the company's client database during her lunch break. Using techniques the FBI had taught her, she was able to view restricted files that showed TCI was billing for services that matched exactly the specifications mentioned in the Operation Lake Mirror communications she had decoded weeks earlier. The company was not just selling technology to foreign governments. They were actively participating in espionage operations against the United States. Sarah carefully documented everything she found and passed the information to Agent Shun through a secure communication system the FBI had established. Chen's response was immediate and alarming. The FBI had been monitoring other suspected companies and discovered that TCI was part of a much larger network involving at least a dozen American businesses and several high-ranking government officials. The investigation had reached a critical phase, and Sarah was asked to take greater risks to gather evidence. She needed Sarah to access physical documents and computer files that could only be obtained by breaking into restricted areas of the TCI building. Sarah would have to work after hours when security was reduced, but the potential payoff was enormous. On a Friday evening in late October, Sarah implemented the plan she and Agent Chun had developed. She remained in the building after normal business hours, hiding in a supply closet until the security guards completed their routine sweep. Then, she made her way to David Kumar's office, where the FBI believed crucial planning documents were stored. Using lock-picking tools the FBI had provided, Sarah gained access to Kumar's office and began photographing documents with a miniature camera. What she found exceeded even the FBI's expectations. Kumar had been maintaining detailed records of technology transfers to Soviet military installations, including blueprints for the underwater communication station that Operation Lake Mirror had referenced. More shocking was a communication log that showed Kumar had been in direct contact with the agents who had thrown Sarah from the helicopter. The log referred to asset termination and security containment, making it clear that Kumar knew about the attempt on her life. Sarah realized she was sitting in the office of one of the people responsible for trying to murder her. As Sarah continued photographing documents, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Someone was approaching Kumar's office, and Sarah had no way to escape without being seen. She quickly gathered the documents and hid behind Kumar's desk, hoping the person would pass by without entering the office. But the footsteps stopped directly outside the door, and Sarah heard the sound of a key being inserted into the lock. Someone was entering the office, and Sarah was trapped with evidence that would expose the entire espionage network if discovered. She clutched the camera and prepared for a confrontation that could determine the fate of the investigation and her own survival. The door opened, and fluorescent lights flooded the office. Sarah held her breath and remained motionless behind the desk, knowing that discovery would mean not just the failure of her mission, but likely her death. Footsteps moved around the office, and Sarah could hear papers being shuffled and file drawers being opened. Then, a voice she recognized spoke quietly into a phone. "The documents are secure, but we may have a problem. Security reports indicate someone accessed the building outside normal hours. We need to accelerate the timeline and implement final protocols immediately." It was Elena Volkov, and she was clearly communicating with other members of the espionage network. Sarah realized that her infiltration had been detected and the entire operation was about to be exposed. She had minutes, perhaps less, before armed agents arrived to eliminate the security threat. She represented Sarah remained motionless behind Kumar's desk as Elena Volkov continued her phone conversation. Through careful listening, Sarah learned that the espionage network was planning to evacuate key personnel and destroy evidence within the next 24 hours. Volkov mentioned specific names and locations that Sarah knew would be crucial for the FBI's investigation. When Volkov finally left the office, Sarah waited several minutes before emerging from her hiding place. She had to make a critical decision: attempt to escape immediately with the evidence she had already gathered, or take the enormous risk of staying longer to collect information about the network's evacuation plans. The intelligence she had just overheard could lead to the capture of dozens of foreign agents and their American collaborators. Sarah chose to stay. She made her way carefully through the darkened building to Volkov's office, using the lock-picking skills the FBI had taught her to gain entry. Inside, she found exactly what she was looking for: detailed evacuation plans, lists of safe houses, and communication protocols for emergency situations. More importantly, she discovered a master list of all network participants, including several names that shocked her with their high-ranking positions in government and military organizations. As Sarah photographed the critical documents, she heard vehicles arriving outside the building. Through the window, she could see black SUVs positioning themselves around the entrances. Armed men in tactical gear were deploying to secure the building. The security breach had triggered a full response from the espionage network, and Sarah was about to be trapped inside. But Sarah had one advantage that her enemies did not expect. During her weeks of preparation with the FBI, she had studied the building's blueprints and identified multiple escape routes. There was a service tunnel that connected the basement to a storm drain system, providing access to the street several blocks away. Sarah had hoped never to use this escape route, but the situation left her no choice. Sarah made her way to the basement as armed men entered the upper floors of the building. She could hear them conducting a systematic search, moving from office to office as they looked for the intruder. Sarah reached the service tunnel entrance just as she heard footsteps on the basement stairs. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but Sarah navigated it using a small flashlight the FBI had provided. The sound of her pursuers faded as she crawled through the underground passage toward the storm drain system. After 20 minutes of difficult movement through cramped spaces, she emerged through a drainage grate into an alley behind a restaurant 3 blocks from the TCI building. Sarah immediately contacted Agent Chun using an emergency communication protocol. Within an hour, FBI tactical teams were surrounding the TCI building and several other locations identified in the documents Sarah had photographed. The simultaneous raids netted 23 suspects, including David Kumar, Elena Volkov, and Jennifer Harrison. More importantly, the evidence Sarah had gathered led to the identification of the government officials who had been protecting the espionage network. Among those arrested over the following days were a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, 2 senior NSA analysts, and a congressional aide who had been providing classified information to foreign handlers for over 3 years. The investigation also revealed the truth about Operation Lake Mirror. It was not a Soviet infiltration plan, but rather a joint operation between American traders and foreign intelligence services to establish a permanent espionage infrastructure in the Great Lakes region. The underwater communication station Sarah had identified in her original analysis was real, but it was being built with American technology provided by the conspirators. Frank Rodriguez, Sarah's former supervisor, was arrested at his home in Cleveland. During his interrogation, he revealed that Sarah had been targeted for elimination because her skills as an analyst made her too dangerous to the network's security. The decision to kill her had been made by the American participants in the conspiracy, who feared that her investigation would expose their activities. The agents who had thrown Sarah from the helicopter were identified as contract killers working for the espionage network, not legitimate government operatives. Both men were arrested within a week of the initial raids, and they provided information that led to the dismantling of similar networks in other parts of the country. 6 months after her supposed death, Sarah was finally able to resume her real identity and return to her husband Tom. The reunion was emotional and difficult, as Tom struggled to understand why Sarah had allowed him to believe she was dead for so long. But as the full scope of the conspiracy became public knowledge, he realized that Sarah's sacrifice had prevented a massive compromise of American national security. Sarah's courage and determination had exposed one of the largest espionage networks in American history. The information she gathered during her undercover work led to the conviction of 47 individuals and the prevention of technology transfers that could have given foreign governments significant military advantages. The case became a model for counterintelligence operations, and Sarah was eventually recruited to help train other agents in similar techniques. She never returned to routine intelligence analysis, instead becoming a specialist in deep cover operations against foreign espionage networks. The underwater communication station that had started the entire investigation was located and destroyed by Navy divers 3 months after the arrests. The site, in 60 feet of water off the Ohio coast of Erie Lake, contained sophisticated equipment that could have monitored communications across the entire Great Lakes region. Years later, when asked about her decision to risk everything for the investigation, Sarah would simply say that some things were worth dying for, and protecting her country was one of them. She had surfaced from the dark waters of Erie Lake not just as a survivor, but as a guardian of American security who had helped preserve the nation's most crucial secrets. The memory of that September evening when she was thrown from a helicopter would always remain with Sarah. But rather than a symbol of victimization, it became a reminder of her strength and her commitment to justice. She had emerged from the depths with war room orders that helped defeat an enemy operating in the shadows, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons against betrayal are courage, intelligence, and an unwavering determination to protect what matters most. As Sarah rounded a corner, she spotted 3 targets positioned in a challenging configuration that required precise timing to neutralize without exposing herself to return fire. She dropped to one knee, steadied her breathing, and fired 3 quick, accurate shots. All 3 targets dropped immediately, a textbook example of tactical shooting. But instead of acknowledgement from her team, she heard Petty Officer Jenkins, the squad's unofficial leader, speaking into his radio with obvious frustration. "Command, we've got soft serve playing hero again. She's going to get us all killed with her cowboy tactics." The words hit Sarah harder than any physical blow she had endured during training. She had executed the maneuver perfectly, exactly as they had been taught, but because it was her pulling the trigger, it was somehow wrong. The unfairness of it all made her hands shake with suppressed anger as they continued through the exercise. Later that evening, as Sarah sat alone in the base library trying to study tactical manuals, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. A group of SEALs were discussing an upcoming weekend liberty, planning to visit a bar in downtown San Diego where they regularly went to unwind after particularly difficult training periods. "We should bring soft serve along," one of them said with a laugh that held no humor. "Show her what real warriors do when they're off duty. Maybe she'll finally realize she doesn't belong here and save us all the embarrassment of watching her fail." Another voice chimed in. "I heard she's never even been in a real fight. Grew up in LA, but somehow avoided all the gang violence. Probably had mommy and daddy protecting their little princess." The assumption stung because it was completely wrong. Sarah had been in more fights than she cared to remember, defending herself and her younger brother from neighborhood bullies who thought a small girl and a skinny kid made easy targets. She had learned to fight dirty when necessary, to use her size and speed as advantages rather than weaknesses. But here on the base, surrounded by men who measured toughness only in terms of how much weight you could lift or how loud you could yell, those skills seemed irrelevant. The conversation continued with increasingly crude speculation about her background and her motivations for joining the SEALs. They painted her as some kind of publicity stunt, a political correctness hire who was being given special treatment because of her gender. The truth was that Sarah had scored higher on the entrance exams than most of them, had completed every phase of training despite the additional challenges she faced, and had never once asked for any kind of accommodation or special consideration. As she listened to them plan their weekend outing, Sarah found herself hoping they would follow through on their joking invitation. Part of her wanted the chance to show them a different side of herself, to prove that the quiet demeanor they mistook for weakness was actually something much more dangerous. She had learned long ago that the most effective fighters were often the ones who appeared least threatening until the moment action was required. That night, Sarah made another decision that would prove to be crucial in the days to come. Instead of avoiding the situation or trying to prove herself through conventional means within the training environment, she decided that if the opportunity arose, she would accept their invitation to join them at their favorite downtown bar. She would walk into their territory on their terms and see what happened when the controlled environment of the training base was replaced by the unpredictable reality of civilian life. She had no way of knowing that this decision would put her in a position where everything she had learned about combat, strategy, and survival would be tested in ways that had nothing to do with military training exercises. The bar they frequented was about to become a stage where real courage would be measured, and where the laughter that had followed her for weeks would transform into something entirely different. The weekend was approaching fast, and Sarah found herself both dreading and anticipating what might unfold. She had spent her entire time at the base being underestimated and dismissed, but she had also been quietly observing and learning things about her tormentors that they probably didn't realize she had noticed. Soon, all of that careful observation would prove invaluable in ways none of them could have predicted, and the laughter would turn to something entirely different. Friday evening arrived with the kind of Southern California weather that made people forget their troubles and think about cold drinks and good times. Sarah was in her quarters, methodically cleaning her gear and preparing for another weekend of solitary study, when Petty Officer Jenkins appeared in her doorway with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, soft serve," he said, using the nickname with the casual cruelty that had become second nature to him. "Me and the boys are heading downtown tonight. Figure maybe you'd like to come along, see how real SEALs blow off steam." Sarah looked up from the rifle she was cleaning, studying his face carefully. She could see the challenge in his expression, the assumption that she would decline and give him another reason to question her belonging in their world. Behind him, she could make out the shapes of several other SEALs lingering in the hallway, probably waiting to see how this little drama would play out. "What kind of place?" she asked, her voice steady and neutral. Jenkins shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just a bar downtown. Nothing fancy. Place called Murphy's Tavern. Good drinks, good music, regular people having a good time. Might be a little rough around the edges for someone like you, though." The way he said "someone like you" carried all the implications he intended. Sarah could see exactly what this was, an attempt to put her in an uncomfortable situation where she would either decline and prove their point about her being too soft for their world, or accept and potentially embarrass herself in front of civilians who would judge her just as harshly as her fellow trainees. Sarah set down her cleaning cloth and looked directly into Jenkins' eyes. "What time are we leaving?" The surprise on his face was brief, but unmistakable. He had clearly expected her to make excuses or find reasons to avoid the invitation. We're meeting at the gate at 2000 hours. Civilian clothes, obviously." "I'll be there," Sarah said simply, returning her attention to her rifle. Jenkins lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to add some warning or additional challenge, but apparently couldn't think of anything that wouldn't reveal his true intentions too obviously. "All right then," he said finally. "See you at 8. After he left, Sarah continued cleaning her weapon, but her mind was racing. She knew exactly what Murphy's Tavern was like, because she had grown up in neighborhoods filled with places just like it. Working-class bars where men went to drink away the frustrations of their week, where conversations could turn heated quickly, and where someone like her would stand out like a neon sign. She also knew that Jenkins and his friends had no idea what they were setting up. They saw a small, quiet woman who they assumed had lived a sheltered life and would be intimidated by a rough bar full of loud, drunk civilians. They couldn't know that she had learned to navigate exactly those kinds of environments before she was old enough to legally drink in them. At exactly 8 o'clock, Sarah appeared at the base gate wearing dark jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and boots that looked casual but were actually designed for quick movement and stability. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried herself with the same quiet confidence that her tormentors consistently misread as timidity. The group of SEALs waiting for her consisted of Jenkins, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Morrison, all of them built like linebackers and carrying themselves with the swagger that came from knowing they were among the most elite fighters in the world. When they saw Sarah approaching, she caught the quick glances they exchanged, the barely concealed amusement at what they clearly viewed as a lamb walking into their lion's den. Well, Rodriguez said with a grin. "Didn't think you'd actually show up, Martinez." "I said I would be here," Sarah replied simply. The drive to downtown San Diego took about 20 minutes, with the conversation in the truck dominated by stories about previous nights at Murphy's Tavern. They talked about bar fights they had witnessed, civilians who had tried to challenge them and quickly learned the error of their ways, and women who had been impressed by their military credentials. Sarah listened quietly, filing away information about their attitudes and expectations. Murphy's Tavern turned out to be exactly what Sarah had expected, a dimly lit establishment with weathered wood paneling neon beer signs, and the kind of lived-in atmosphere that came from decades of serving blue-collar workers who needed a place to forget their troubles for a few hours. The jukebox was playing classic rock. The air was thick with cigarette smoke despite the supposed ban, and the crowd was predominantly male, predominantly white, and predominantly looking for any excuse to prove their toughness. As they found a table near the back of the bar, Sarah noticed several things that her companions seemed oblivious to. The bartender was keeping a close eye on their group, clearly recognizing military personnel, and knowing from experience that soldiers and sailors could mean either good business or serious trouble. Several of the regulars were sizing them up as well, the kind of men who had been in their share of conflicts and wouldn't be easily intimidated by military credentials. Most importantly, Sarah noticed a group of 3 men at the far end of the bar who were already drunk and looking for trouble. They had been watching their table since the moment they walked in, and she could see the calculation in their eyes as they assessed the newcomers. These weren't the kind of men who would back down from a fight, just because their opponents happened to be Navy SEALs. Jenkins ordered the first round of drinks, making a show of his generosity while keeping up a running commentary about the local color in the bar. His friends laughed at his observations, but Sarah could see that they were already underestimating their environment, treating the bar like an extension of their training facility where they held all the advantages. As the evening progressed and the alcohol began to flow more freely, the SEALs became louder and more aggressive in their behavior. They started making comments about other patrons, challenging each other to increasingly ridiculous displays of strength, and generally acting like men who believed their training made them invincible in any situation. Sarah continued to nurse her first beer while watching everything unfold around her. She could see the tension building, could feel the atmosphere in the bar shifting from casual Friday night relaxation to something more dangerous. The group of drunk men at the end of the bar were getting more agitated. Other patrons were starting to give their table a wider berth, and the bartender was showing signs of the kind of nervousness that preceded serious trouble. What her companions didn't realize was that Sarah had been in this exact situation many times before, and she knew exactly how it was going to end. The trouble started, as it often does, with something small and stupid. Rodriguez had just finished telling a particularly loud story about a training exercise when one of the drunk men from the end of the bar stumbled over to their table. He was probably in his 40s, wearing a faded Harley-Davidson t-shirt and the kind of scowl that suggested he had been looking for a fight since before they arrived. "You boys sure are making a lot of noise," the man said, his words slurred but his intentions clear. "Some of us are trying to drink in peace." Jenkins looked up with the kind of confidence that came from years of knowing he could handle any civilian who wanted to cause trouble. "Sorry if we're disturbing your beauty sleep, Grandpa. Maybe you should head home to your wife." The insult had exactly the effect Sarah had expected. The man's face flushed red, and she could see his hands clenching into fists. More importantly, she noticed his 2 friends pushing back from the bar and starting to move in their direction. What really caught her attention, though, was the bartender reaching under the counter for what was probably either a phone to call the police or something more immediately useful for stopping trouble. "You think you're pretty tough, soldier boy," the man said, leaning forward aggressively. "Just because you got some muscles and a buzz cut doesn't mean you can disrespect people in their own neighborhood." Thompson started to stand up, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made half the bar turn in their direction. "Why don't you go back to your corner and mind your own business before you get hurt?" Sarah could see everything unfolding exactly as she had predicted. Her fellow SEALs were operating under the assumption that their military training gave them automatic superiority in any conflict with civilians. They had no idea that the 3 men approaching them had probably been in more real fights than all of them combined, or that bar fights followed completely different rules than anything they had learned in their controlled training environment. What happened next unfolded with the kind of sudden violence that catches people off guard even when they're expecting it. The first drunk man threw a wild punch at Thompson, who easily ducked it and responded with a textbook straight right that dropped his attacker immediately. The problem was that his 2 friends had been waiting for exactly that moment to launch their own attack. The first friend came at Rodriguez with a beer bottle, swinging it in a wide arc that would have connected with devastating effect if Rodriguez hadn't been trained to recognize and counter such attacks. But as he moved to disarm his attacker, the second friend blindsided Jenkins with a tackle that sent both of them crashing into a neighboring table. Suddenly, the entire bar erupted into chaos. Other patrons who had been minding their own business found themselves caught in the middle of flying fists and breaking glass. The bartender was shouting something about calling the police while trying to protect his expensive bottles. Women were screaming and heading for the exits, and what had started as a confrontation between 6 men quickly expanded to include half the bar. Sarah watched all of this unfold from her seat with the kind of calm assessment that came from having survived similar situations before. She could see that her fellow SEALs, despite their superior training, were making critical mistakes. They were fighting like they were in a training exercise, trying to use proper technique and following rules of engagement that meant nothing in a real bar fight. Thompson had put down his first attacker, but was now facing 2 more men who had decided to join the fight for reasons that had nothing to do with the original dispute. Rodriguez was wrestling with the bottle-wielding drunk, but was clearly holding back, trying to subdue rather than seriously injure his opponent. Jenkins was trading punches with his attacker, but was doing it in a standing position that left him vulnerable to anyone who might attack from behind. Morrison, the youngest of the group, was backing toward the wall with wide eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden transition from controlled military exercise to real-world violence where there were no referees or safety protocols. That's when Sarah saw the man with the knife. He had been sitting quietly at a corner table when the fight started, but as the chaos spread through the bar, he stood up and began moving toward Morrison with a blade that glinted in the neon light. Sarah could see the predatory focus in his eyes, the way he was timing his approach to catch Morrison when the young SEAL was most distracted by the other fighting around him. None of the other SEALs had noticed the new threat. They were too focused on their individual battles to maintain the kind of situational awareness that might have saved their teammate's life. The knife-wielding man was 3 steps away from Morrison when Sarah finally moved. She didn't shout a warning or try to alert the others. Instead, she exploded from her chair with the kind of explosive speed that came from years of street fighting where hesitation meant serious injury. She covered the distance to the attacker in 2 quick steps, arriving just as he raised a knife to strike. Sarah's first move was to grab the man's wrist and twist it in a direction that human joints weren't designed to bend. The knife clattered to the floor as he screamed in pain, but Sarah wasn't finished. Her knee came up in a devastating strike to his solar plexus that folded him over, gasping for air. Before he could recover, her elbow came down on the back of his neck with precisely the amount of force needed to put him down without causing permanent damage. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds and was executed with a kind of brutal efficiency that spoke of extensive real-world experience. As the knife attacker collapsed unconscious at Morrison's feet, Sarah was already turning to assess the rest of the fight. What she saw was chaos that needed to be ended quickly before someone got seriously hurt or the police arrived to arrest everyone involved. The 3 original attackers were still engaged with their fellow SEALs, but more men were joining the fight every few seconds, drawn in by alcohol, adrenaline, and the pack mentality that took over in situations like this. Sarah moved through the melee like a force of nature, using techniques that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with survival in environments where being small and female meant you had to end fights before they really began. She hit pressure points that dropped opponents instantly, used leverage and momentum to turn larger men's size against them, and moved with a fluidity that made it clear this wasn't her first rodeo. In less than 2 minutes, the fight was over. The original 3 attackers were down, and staying down, the knife-wielding man was unconscious, and several other would-be participants had decided that discretion was the better part of valor. The bar fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Sarah stood in the center of the destruction, barely breathing hard, while her fellow SEALs stared at her with expressions of complete shock. The woman they had called Soft Serve for weeks, the recruit they had assumed couldn't handle real conflict, had just single-handedly ended a bar fight that could have resulted in serious injuries or death. For all of them, the silence that followed the fight was broken by the sound of police sirens growing louder as they approached Murphy's Tavern. Sarah looked around at the scene of destruction and then at her fellow SEALs, who were still staring at her with a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been respect. "We need to leave," she said simply, her voice calm despite the adrenaline that was probably coursing through her system. "Now." The bartender, who had witnessed the entire confrontation, caught her eye and gave her a slight nod. "Back door," he said quietly, pointing toward a hallway that led to the rear of the building. "You've got maybe 2 minutes before the cops get here." Jenkins, still nursing a cut on his lip from his fight, looked around at the unconscious men scattered across the floor. "We can't just leave them like this." Sarah was already moving toward the back door, but she paused to look back at him. "They started the fight. They brought weapons into it. And if we're here when the police arrive, we'll all be facing disciplinary action that could end our military careers. Is that really what you want?" The logic was unassailable, and within 30 seconds, all 5 of them were moving quickly through the back alley behind the bar. They could hear the police cars pulling up in front of the building as they reached their truck and drove away into the San Diego night. The ride back to base was completely different from the journey earlier in the evening. Instead of the casual arrogance and dismissive comments that had characterized their earlier conversation, the truck was filled with a tense silence, broken only by occasional glances in Sarah's direction through the rearview mirror. Finally, Rodriguez spoke up from the passenger seat. "Where the hell did you learn to fight like that?" Sarah looked out the window at the passing streetlights before answering. "East LA. When you're small and you have a younger brother to protect, you learn fast or you don't survive." "That wasn't street fighting," Thompson said from the seat beside her. "That was something else entirely. The way you moved, the techniques you used, that was professional-level stuff." "My dad was a Marine," Sarah said quietly. "He taught me that size doesn't matter if you know what you're doing. And I've been doing this a lot longer than any of you have been laughing at me for being soft." Morrison, who was driving, caught her eyes in the rearview mirror. "You saved my life back there. I didn't even see the guy with the knife until he was on the ground." "That's because you were fighting like you were still in training," Sarah replied without any malice in her voice. "In the real world, there are no rules and no referees. People will use weapons, they'll attack from behind, and they'll do whatever it takes to win. You have to be aware of everything all the time, not just the person directly in front of you." Jenkins, who had been unusually quiet since they left the bar, finally spoke up. "We owe you an apology, Martinez. All of us." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that hadn't been there before. The casual cruelty was gone, replaced by what looked like genuine remorse. "We've been treating you like you don't belong here," he continued. "Like you're some kind of liability that's going to get people killed. But tonight you proved that we're the ones who don't know what we're doing when things get real." "You're good at following procedures," Sarah said. "You're strong, you're dedicated, and you can handle anything the instructors throw at you in a controlled environment. But real combat isn't controlled. It's messy and unpredictable, and sometimes the person who looks least dangerous is the one who's going to save your life." The conversation that followed during the rest of the drive back to base was unlike anything that had happened between them before. For the first time, her fellow SEALs asked her real questions about her background, her training, and her experiences growing up in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Los Angeles. They listened to her answers without judgment or dismissive comments, beginning to understand that the quiet confidence they had mistaken for weakness was actually the result of surviving situations that none of them had ever faced. Back at the base, word of what had happened at Murphy's Tavern spread quickly through the SEAL community. The story grew in the telling, as stories often do, but the core facts remained the same. The woman they had all been calling Soft Sir had single-handedly ended a bar fight that could have resulted in serious injuries for some of the Navy's most elite warriors. The nickname disappeared overnight, replaced by a simple Martinez that carried a weight of respect that hadn't been there before. During training exercises, her teammates began listening to her tactical suggestions instead of dismissing them. When she spoke up during briefings, instructors paid attention instead of showing barely concealed skepticism. More importantly, Sarah found herself being included in conversations and activities that had previously been closed to her. Her fellow SEALs began asking for her input on techniques for close-quarters combat, wanting to learn from someone who had clearly mastered skills that weren't taught in any military manual. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Years of ingrained attitudes don't change overnight, and there were still moments when Sarah had to prove herself in ways that her male counterparts never did. But the foundation had shifted in a fundamental way. She was no longer seen as an outsider trying to earn her place in their world. She was recognized as a warrior who had already proven her worth under the most demanding circumstances possible. Months later, when Sarah graduated from SEAL training with honors and received her assignment to an operational team, Jenkins approached her after the ceremony. The arrogance that had once defined his interactions with her was completely gone, replaced by the kind of respect that could only be earned through shared danger and proven competence. "I wanted to thank you," he said, offering his hand. "Not just for what you did that night at Murphy's, but for showing us what real strength looks like. We thought we were teaching you how to be a warrior, but it turned out you were the one who had lessons to teach us." Sarah shook his hand and smiled, thinking about how much had changed since that first day when she had walked through the base cafeteria listening to cruel laughter behind her back. The laughter had stopped that night in the bar, replaced by something much more valuable. The understanding that true warriors came in many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one everyone underestimated. As she prepared for her first operational deployment, Sarah carried with her not just the technical skills she had learned during training, but also the knowledge that she had earned her place through more than just meeting standards or checking boxes. She had proven herself in the kind of real-world situation where lives hung in the balance and split-second decisions determined who went home safely. The bar fight at Murphy's Tavern had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact would influence the rest of her military career and beyond. She had turned the battlefield into exactly what it needed to be, a place where skill, experience, and courage mattered more than size, gender, or anyone's preconceived notions about what a warrior should look like.